So I'm going to give you 3 exercises from my writing from the Stoics that I think will allow you to use this uncertain, scary thing to have a more purposeful existence while you're here. The first exercise comes to us from Seneca. Seneca's an interesting philosopher because, again, he's not an academic. He's a playwright. He's a Roman senator. He actually becomes one of Rome's most influential power brokers. He's the advisor and the tutor to the emperor. And he writes in this letter to a friend, one of his dear friends, he writes a letter about how he should think about death. And he says that the mistake is that we think of death as something in the future, something we're moving towards as time is passing. In fact, he says, death is happening right now. The time that's passed is owned by death. Instead of thinking that, for instance, I would be lucky enough to live into my late 70s, I should think instead that I've already died 32 years, right? Seneca says we are dying every day. We're dying every minute. You're dying sitting here listening to me talk, so I hope it's worth it. But we have to get better at managing this precious resource, Seneca is saying, that we fritter away our time. Meanwhile, we strongly and strictly guard our property and our money. But what's more renewable? You can always buy more property. You can always earn more money. What you can't ever do is find or create more time. So we waste this most precious resource on going to meetings that we don't want to go to, signing up for things we don't actually want to do. We don't say no because we're afraid to say no because we don't want to be the bad guy. We give up our most precious resource. We give time away to death. I think what you also take from this, it's an important caveat, is that other people's time is really valuable too. When you take too long in line, when you treat family members poorly, when you go slower than you need to, when you slow other people down, you're taking away time from them that they will never get back. This is a lesson from Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius is the emperor of Rome. If you don't know who Marcus Aurelius is, he's the guy in the movie Gladiator that Joaquin Phoenix's character kills. But what's interesting is Marcus Aurelius writes this journal. It's called Meditations. What's even more interesting is that he wrote a big chunk of it here in Budapest, right up in the Roman camp, not far from the city. And what he writes in Meditations, he asks this question. He asks it to himself. He never knew that we would read it. But he says, stop whatever you're doing at this moment and ask yourself, am I afraid of death because I won't be able to do this anymore? And by this, he means what we spend so much of our time doing. Are you afraid of death because you won't be able to play video games anymore? Because you won't be able to watch pornography on your computer? Because you won't be able to argue with people you don't know on the internet? Because you won't be able to sit on your couch and get drunk or high? These are not reasons to be afraid of death. You shouldn't be afraid of death at all, he's saying. But what you definitely shouldn't do is be afraid of death. And then when you have life, sit here and waste it on things that don't matter. Seneca says it even more bluntly. He says, you are scared of dying, but tell me, is the kind of life you lead any different than being dead? And there are so many forms of life that are a kind of death, right? A life filled with resentment, a life filled with regret, a life that's all about you, a life that's all about chasing fame or money or power, a life of loneliness or isolation. These are forms of living death. When we think about our mortality, it wakes us up to that fact. It gives us perspective on how meaningless a lot of the things we spend our time chasing are and the expense that those things come at, right? We put things off to the future. I'll start a family later. I'll follow my dream job later. I'll start that company later. We need more and more time because what we're not doing is being present. We're not taking advantage of what's in front of us right now. We don't want to postpone anything. We want to balance life's books each day. The final lesson comes from Epictetus. Epictetus is a former slave who becomes an influential philosopher. He actually is one of the leading influences in Marcus Aurelius' life. And this is a controversial exercise, a little dark, I'll admit. But Epictetus says, as you kiss your child goodnight, whisper to yourself, he may be dead in the morning. He may be dead in the morning. That's heavy, right? It's important because what that does is it makes you present. It makes you realize what you're doing, how important this thing you're doing is, and how you can't take it for granted. It was said Marcus Aurelius practiced this exercise each evening, which hauntingly was necessary. He unfortunately lost several of his children when the infant mortality rate was much higher than it is now, right? Life is fragile. Life is short. You can't take that for granted. You can't do that. A few years ago, a friend of mine, his name was Seth Roberts, he sent me an email on a Friday afternoon. I saw it. I said, I love Seth, but I'm busy. I'll get to this on Monday. The next day, he went for a hike and he fell dead of a heart attack. I never got to respond to that. I never got to talk to him that one last time, even though he reached out to me. Another one of my friends, a guy named Brett Barrett, I remember I was in the airport in Chicago and I was thinking, I should send Brett a text. I haven't seen him in a while. And then I was boarding my flight and I got distracted. And when I landed, I had another text from a different friend who said that Brett had passed away in his sleep that afternoon and they just found him. And so I'll never get those lost conversations back, but I can learn from that mistake. One of the interesting things about being a parent, about being a busy, ambitious person, you're often rushing, right? You rush through bedtime. You rush through dinner with your spouse. You rush through your drive home. You're rushing. You got things to do. You got places to be. But what the Stoics would ask is, what are you rushing towards? They would say you're rushing towards death. You're rushing away from the people you love. And you're doing it so you can watch more Netflix or respond to more emails or play apps on your phone. This is not why you should be rushing. And so when you realize this, you slow down, you appreciate, you enjoy, you breathe in, you don't take it for granted. In light of our mortality, it's arrogant to blow people off, to ignore them, to defer till later, to make plans for the distant future. It's ridiculous. And instead, you want to take advantage of what's in front of you. You want to seize it. There's two ways to think about this memento mori, this meditation on mortality. It can be depressing, it can be sad, or it can connect you with something that deeply makes us human. As I was standing in this 2,000-year-old amphitheater up the river, I could just feel the people that had been there before, how many generations of human beings had lived and died and how long this was going on. This is a vintage shirt. Sometimes I think about the person who wore it before me and if they're still alive or not, or what they experienced. In 2003, the country musician Rosanne Cash lost her mother, her father, her stepmother, and her sister, all of relatively natural causes. And this was heartbreaking. But what she said she took from this was a realization that everyone has experiences like this, and everyone always has had experiences like this, and that it reminds you of the little pleasantries in life, the connections, the meaning, the relationships we have with people, how important they are, and how we can't take them for granted, and how, she said, loss is the great unifier, the terrible club that we all eventually belong to. But I think it's just a club that humans have always belonged to and always will belong to. We're the only species that knows we're mortal, and it seems strange to ignore that, to pretend that it's not true. And instead, we want to use it to find meaning and purpose and clarity. Over the last few years, I got to know a man in Austin. His name was Richard Overton. He was born in 1906. In 1906, Theodore Roosevelt was president of the United States. There were still people potentially who were born in the 1700s who were alive when Richard was born. The car is new. So many things haven't happened. And there he is. He serves in World War II. He fights in the Pacific, comes home to Texas, and he survives segregation. He builds a life for himself. And I got to know him. He's a wonderful man. He lived a fantastically interesting life. He would smoke cigars every day. He would drink whiskey, and he ate ice cream, which tells you all the things that doctors tell you are really important. Maybe they don't matter. But he was always surrounded by friends, surrounded by family. He knew all his neighbors. He showed me a tree he planted in his front yard that was 70 years old. That's how long he'd lived in this house. And he was a wonderful man. And I learned two things from Richard. Number one, that you go when you go, right? I never felt from Richard that 112 years old was not enough, right? There's all these people that want to live forever, that are afraid to die. When you meet really old people, you don't get that sense that they're hanging on, that what you actually get is presence, and you get gratitude, and you get perspective. But one day I asked Richard, I said, Richard, how do you live to be 112? What's your secret? I said, do you just take it day by day? And he said, nah, at my age, you take it day by night. And I think that's an insight worthy of the Stoics. You can't get too far ahead of yourself. You can't take anything for granted. You can't defer things into the future. You have to be present. You have to enjoy what's there in front of you. You have to connect. And Richard passed away at the beginning of this year, buried with some of his favorite things you can see there. But he's a wonderful man. They even named the street that he lived on after him, and they're probably going to turn his house into a museum. I feel very lucky to have connected with someone like that, and it connected with this practice that I'm talking to you guys about today. The last lesson I would give you, the last thought, came to me when I was on a run in Philadelphia last last year. I was really busy. I was finishing up a book that I wanted to be a success. I was trying to build my business. I was about to give a talk. And I went for this run, and I was running through this old neighborhood in Philadelphia, outside Philadelphia. And I came across this old Revolutionary War cemetery. And it was filled with all these enormous tombstones erected in people's honors with statues and all the things they accomplished. And one of the oldest ones was sitting there on the ground. It wasn't high. It wasn't big. It was very quiet, very subdued. It was from one of the oldest people in the cemetery. She actually died in 1805, so she was born in the mid-1700s. And on this tombstone, you can barely read it, but it says, "Verses on tombstones are but idly spent. The living character is the monument." And I think that's the essence of what I want to leave you guys with, that you get one life. We don't know what happens to us when we die. We don't know what happens after. Some people think they know, but we don't know, right? And so what matters is what you do now. What matters is what you do with the time in front of you, because that's the only thing that's certain. The present moment is the only thing that's certain. And so you can't delay, you can't waste, you can't assume anything. You must take advantage of what's in front of you. And we can end then with this final thought from Marcus Aurelius. Marcus, who talked about Memento Mori, about meditating on our mortality, he gives us one thought. And again, he might have written it here in this very city 2,000 years ago. He said, "Think of yourself as dead. You have lived your life. Now take what's left and live it properly." Memento Mori. Thank you.
So Memento Mori is the ancient practice of meditating on the fact that you will die, that we are fragile beings, that we could go at any moment. And we created the Memento Mori medallion to have a sort of a physical totem that you could carry with you, that you could touch to remind you of your own mortality. And people wanted a version of it, though, that they could wear. And so we made it. You can see on the inside, it says, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." That's why I carry it with me everywhere.
Hey, thanks for watching Daily Stoic. If you want to learn more about Stoicism, you can check out some of our other videos here. Subscribe, we'd really appreciate it. Keep learning, keep studying, and remember those 4 Stoic virtues: courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom.